The winter of 1975 found Elvis Presley at a crossroads few could see from the outside. On the surface, he was still the king of rock and roll, dazzling audiences in Las Vegas, packing arenas, and carrying the aura of a man larger than life. But behind the curtain, in quieter moments away from the spotlight, Elvis felt something slipping through his hands. That December, while in New York, Elvis attended a concert that shook him in ways he hadn't expected. He stood backstage at Madison Square Garden, his face hidden behind dark glasses, watching Black Sabbath unleash a storm of raw sound before thousands of fans. The music was rough, heavy, almost violent in its honesty. Ozzy Osbourne's voice wasn't polished, but it was unfiltered. It carried rebellion, fear, and truth all at once. Elvis recognized that power instantly, because he had once lived it. And that was what unsettled him most. There was a time in the 1950s when Elvis himself had been called dangerous, when parents feared his hip-shaking performances, when preachers condemned his voice as sinful, and when teenagers screamed because he seemed to give sound to something they didn't yet know how to name. But by 1975, the fire of that rebellion had dimmed. The Vegas contracts, the carefully managed image, the sequined jumpsuits, they all glittered, but they no longer burned. As the crowd roared for Sabbath that night, Elvis asked himself a question he had avoided for years. When did I stop being dangerous? When did I stop being real? It wasn't jealousy he felt, nor resentment. It was recognition. Recognition that the edge he once embodied had been tamed into routine. Recognition that somewhere between Colonel Parker's contracts, the safe set lists, and the endless demands of fame, Elvis Presley the artist had begun to vanish behind Elvis Presley the icon. That night at Madison Square Garden did not change his career on paper. The public never knew he was there, but for Elvis himself, it stirred something long dormant, a hunger to rediscover truth in music, and a fear that he might already be too late. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley was a man caught between two worlds, the unstoppable myth he had become, and the fragile human being who carried it. On stage, the myth dominated. Night after night in Las Vegas, he dazzled audiences with costumes that glittered like stars and a voice that could still fill the largest halls with ease. The crowds came faithfully, singing along, cheering at every familiar note. To them, Elvis was eternal. He was not just an entertainer but a living monument to a cultural revolution he himself had set in motion 2 decades earlier. Yet behind that image, a different Elvis lived, away from the spotlight at Graceland. He often sat alone in the quiet of his music room, surrounded by instruments that seemed to hold memories of a younger, freer version of himself. There he strummed gospel tunes or revisited the raw rhythm and blues that had once set him apart. Those private moments reminded him of who he had been, a boy from Tupelo who turned the world upside down simply by being honest in song. But in the quiet, he also felt the weight of how far he had drifted. The Las Vegas residencies, while lucrative, had become both a blessing and a burden. They guaranteed financial security, yet they also chained him to a cycle of repetition. Every show demanded the same expected hits, the same polished routines. The risk and unpredictability that had once defined him were replaced by precision. He was no longer feared as a dangerous new voice. He was celebrated as nostalgia, a symbol of what once was. For Elvis, that realization hurt more than the physical exhaustion the shows placed on his body. His health was already faltering. Years of grueling tours, a punishing schedule, and growing dependence on prescription medication left him vulnerable. Pills for energy, pills for sleep, pills for pain, they blurred the edges of his days, numbing him enough to keep going, but stealing the sharpness that had once fueled his creativity. Friends noticed changes in his mood and energy, though many around him chose silence rather than confrontation. After all, Elvis wasn't just a man to them. He was an empire. Too many livelihoods depended on him continuing exactly as he was. But Elvis himself felt the decline. He knew his body was heavier, his spirit more tired, and his music less daring. He could see it in the mirror and hear it in his own performances. The applause still thundered, but inside he wondered if it was for him or for the memory of who he had been. That was the conflict gnawing at him. Was he singing for truth or just for expectation? The gospel songs he sang privately revealed his heart. In those melodies stripped of sequins and spotlights, he found the raw honesty that had first driven him. They reminded him of the time when music had been an act of faith, a rebellion, and a lifeline all at once. In contrast, the stage had become a cage. And in the middle of the 1970s, Elvis Presley, the man who had once shaken the world, found himself wondering if he could ever be free again. The memory of that night at Madison Square Garden lingered long after Elvis left New York. Back in the stillness of Graceland, the roar of the Sabbath crowd seemed to echo louder than the applause he received in Las Vegas. It wasn't the volume that haunted him. It was the honesty. What Ozzy Osbourne gave his audience wasn't polished, wasn't rehearsed to perfection. It was raw, almost reckless, and it reminded Elvis of what music was supposed to be, an unfiltered conversation between artist and listener. In the quiet of his music room, Elvis confessed as much to a close friend. "You know what scares me?" he asked, his voice low, heavy with weariness. "It's not that people will stop coming to see me. It's that I'll keep going, night after night, and forget what it felt like to be real. I don't want to become an echo of myself." That kind of honesty didn't come often. To the world, Elvis Presley was untouchable, a man who seemed born to command the stage. But in private, he struggled with questions few could understand. When he looked out at the thousands of fans, he wondered, are they cheering for me or for a memory? Do they see the man or only the myth? Those doubts sank deeper with every Vegas engagement, every contract that locked him into the same safe routine. Colonel Tom Parker, his longtime manager, was a master of commercial strategy. Parker kept Elvis working, kept the money flowing, and ensured the crowds never stopped. But that safety came at a cost. Innovation was discouraged, risks avoided. For years, Parker had argued that audiences didn't want Elvis to change. They wanted him frozen in time, forever the king they remembered. And in many ways, Parker was right. But Elvis knew the truth was more complicated. What audiences craved wasn't repetition, it was connection. And connection required honesty. These realizations gnawed at him. Nights alone at Graceland became long and restless. He turned again to his gospel records, searching for the soul in music that had always grounded him. As he sang those hymns, he remembered what it felt like to stand at Sun Records as a young man, unsure if anyone would care, but pouring every ounce of himself into the sound. That uncertainty had been frightening, but it had also been liberating. In contrast, the certainty of Vegas felt like suffocation. The pills blurred some of that pain, but never erased it. He took them to perform, to sleep, to escape, but they could not quiet the deeper questions. Instead, they left him drifting between exhaustion and wakefulness, trapped in a cycle that dulled his body while sharpening his awareness that something was wrong. He wasn't just tired physically, he was tired of being predictable. Those closest to him began to notice the shift in his words. He spoke less about crowds and more about meaning, less about showmanship and more about truth. It was as though the Madison Square Garden experience had shaken him awake. He didn't envy Black Sabbath, nor did he wish to imitate them. What he envied was their freedom, the ability to walk on stage and give something unfiltered, something untamed. He wondered if he still had that courage, or if the weight of expectation had already silenced it forever. And that was the question pressing hardest against his heart. Could Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, still be real? By the mid-1970s, Graceland had become both a refuge and a prison. To the outside world, it was the palace of a king. Inside, it was a fortress where Elvis wrestled with his private truths. Each night, after the lights dimmed and the house grew quiet, he would wander into the music room. The piano stood there like an old companion, polished but worn from countless nights when he sought answers through its keys. Those who were close to him remember these moments clearly. Elvis would sit alone at the piano, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, and play the songs that mattered most to him. Gospel hymns, spirituals, and old ballads that had shaped his earliest years. These were not performances for an audience. They were confessions, prayers put to melody. In that quiet space, he wasn't Elvis Presley the superstar. He was simply a man searching for peace. There is a memory, often told by his friends, of him singing Unchained Melody late one evening. His voice cracked with emotion, stronger than it had been on stage, because here there was no expectation, no demand to be perfect. The song swelled in the small room, and those who heard him said it was like listening to a man unburden his soul. He leaned into the piano as though the weight of the world sat on his shoulders, pressing each note not for applause but for release. It was in these late-night sessions that Elvis allowed himself to speak openly about what fame had taken from him. He admitted he felt trapped, locked into a cycle of shows and routines that no longer reflected his heart. "I don't want to just sing songs," he confided to a friend. "I want to mean them." That word, mean, carried all the gravity of his struggle. He longed to give something authentic, something beyond the polished veneer the world demanded. The drugs, which had once seemed like a solution, only deepened the conflict. They dulled the pain but also clouded the joy he once found in music. Some nights his playing would falter as the exhaustion took hold, yet he would force himself to continue, as if by pushing through the haze he could touch something true. To him, the piano was not just an instrument. It was a mirror reflecting back both his brilliance and his brokenness. Those around him could feel the tension rising. Elvis was aware of the love his fans still poured out, but he also feared that love was for an image he no longer recognized. "They see the man in the jumpsuit," he said once, "but do they see the man at this piano?" The difference mattered to him more than he ever let the public know. And yet, despite the inner battles, there was a spark that never left him. When he sang privately, especially gospel, there was still fire in his voice. It was as though in the midst of fatigue and doubt, his truest self still surfaced in those sacred melodies. That contrast between the weary performer on stage and the searching man at the piano defined his final years. By the time dawn crept through the Graceland windows, Elvis would often fall silent, staring at the keys as though they held the answer he could never quite reach. For him, music was no longer about fame or fortune. It had become survival, a way of reminding himself that beneath the crown and the legend there was still a man who needed to be heard. Elvis Presley's story has often been told in numbers. 600 million records sold, 31 films made, countless sold-out shows. But these numbers, while staggering, do not reveal the man who sat quietly at his piano in Graceland, wrestling with the weight of his own success. To understand Elvis fully, one must look past the rhinestones and the headlines, and instead listen to the quiet truths of his final years. At the heart of Elvis's journey was a battle between image and identity. The world crowned him as the king of rock and roll, a figure larger than life. Yet behind that crown was a man who craved something simple: authenticity. He wanted to sing not because it was expected, but because it mattered. His late-night sessions at the piano reveal a truth often overlooked, that even in the shadow of fading health and public pressure, Elvis's greatest longing was not for more fame but for meaning. His search speaks to a broader human struggle. Many know what it feels like to be seen in one way by the world while feeling entirely different inside. Elvis's life amplifies that universal truth. He had everything that culture tells us should bring happiness: wealth, power, adoration, yet he still felt a hunger that none of it could satisfy. In that way, his story is not just the tale of a superstar. It is a reminder of how fragile the human spirit can be when burdened by expectation. The drugs, the isolation, and the long tours eroded him, but they did not erase the spark that defined him. That spark was clearest when he returned to gospel music, his first love. In those songs, his voice soared with honesty and conviction. They were not just performances, they were confessions, a way of reaching for something greater than himself. Even in decline, those moments proved that the man inside the legend still burned with authenticity. When Elvis died in August 1977, at just 42 years old, the world mourned the loss of an icon. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, not only to honor the performer, but also to grieve the man whose music had given them so much. Yet perhaps the deeper tragedy was that Elvis himself did not always feel the same love he gave to the world reflected back into his own life. He feared being remembered only as an image, not as the man who longed for truth through his songs. And yet, time has shown that Elvis's search was not in vain. Today, when fans listen to his raw recordings, the gospel tracks, the impromptu piano sessions, the stripped-down performances, they hear not just a legend, but a human being reaching across time. In those moments, Elvis is not the untouchable king. He is a man speaking honestly through music, and that is why his legacy continues to resonate. Elvis Presley's life stands as both a triumph and a warning. It is a triumph because he proved how music can unite generations, cultures, and people across the globe. It is a warning because it shows how fame, unchecked, can blur the line between who we are and who the world wants us to be. But more than anything, it is a story of truth. The truth of a man who, despite the glitter of his crown, still sat at a piano in the early hours, searching for meaning in the only way he knew how. That is the Elvis worth remembering. Not only the king, but the man who longed to be seen, who longed to be heard, and who, through his music, still speaks to us today.